Hello and welcome to Legally Consumed, a consumer products podcast by a consumer products law firm in Australia. I'm Raph Goldenberg, and I'm joined by co-hosts Kay Ho and Will McMinn, who are members of the team at CIE Legal.
We chat with executives of consumer products companies, their legal teams, and industry experts who give us a peek into their journeys as people. We explore industry-changing ideas and even share tips and tricks on how to navigate the consumer products space.
This season, we will feature guests from the automotive, retail, advertising and insights, food, beverage, and primary production and franchising sectors.
Hello, I'm Raph Goldenberg. Welcome to today's episode of Legally Consumed. We're very lucky to be joined today by our guest, Jared Pereira, who's the Senior Legal Counsel at Fonterra. Hi, Jared.
Hi, Raph. I'm really happy to be here.
Great to have you here. And with me as well, co-hosting, is Will McMinn. How you doing, Will?
I'm very well, thanks, Raph.
Excellent. So, Jared, it's great to have you here. We've had a few different guests on the podcast. You're our first lawyer to come on as a guest, but it's a podcast about consumer products, and Fonterra we thought would be a great company, and great to hear your experience, dealing with consumer products and all those sorts of things. But we wanted to start by just kind of letting the audience get to know you a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about your first job and sort of how you ended up where you are now?
My first job in law, my first ever job.
First ever job.
My first ever job was cleaning toilets at Singapore's Changi Airport.
Right.
So I cleaned toilets there, and having dealt with filth and defecation, I thought I might be a lawyer.
Excellent. Well, how long did you clean the toilets for?
Oh, I did that outside of high school and first couple of years at uni.
Yeah.
And it was really good because, it was off hours. It was relatively high paying. It didn't require much thinking on my part. But most importantly, I think it gave me a great sense of achievement because you immediately get a rush of endorphins from moving something from not so clean to very clean. The same reason I enjoy washing dishes now.
Wow. How did you, out of interest, was it a passion that you had that got you, was it a bit like a Kenny situation that got you interested in cleaning toilets?
No, I had an aunt who ran a business there, and they were always looking for people to assist in cleaning Changi Airport. And if you've ever been to Changi Airport, it's a very, very clean place. And that's because they have an army of cleaners and such. And on the other hand, it's also easier to clean a place that's always clean.
Yeah.
If you get my drift, right? And from there, I went to university. I became a lawyer. I first started off at a large international law firm. I stayed there for a year. I realized I didn't want to be a bag carrier for all my life. I'd like to appear in court. And I was impatient as many young people are. And therefore, I moved into government, where I was a prosecutor for the Singapore government and did criminal work for about 6 or 7 years.
Wow.
And I did a range of matters ranging from, murders and rapes to thefts and money laundering and that sort of thing. From my money laundering experience, or rather my experience in prosecuting money laundering and also helping to draft a bit of Singapore's money laundering legislation back in the day, I was asked to join an international investment bank to assist them with their money laundering compliance, which I did. And I moved in-house. I worked there for a couple of years, and they were then looking for someone to move to Australia to help to run the business here from a legal perspective. So I said, okay, why not? Jumped on a plane with the wife and at the time a very young daughter and a very young son, and we moved here, stayed with the bank for a couple of years. Thereafter, I moved to consumer credit in Australia and did that for about 5 or 6 years and wanted to do something else, and fell into FMCG with Fonterra. That was about 5 or 6 years ago.
Right. So you're actually quite old then, Jared.
While I look 20 in my 20s, I mean, the inside, I'm probably closer to my 80s.
Okay.
And listeners can look up your picture that we'll have up on the website.
Yes.
And you also, before we started recording, you mentioned that you spent some time in the army as well.
Yes, only because in Singapore, I'm originally from Singapore. In Singapore, it's compulsory for all men to do 2.5 years full-time national service before university, and then thereafter up to 40 days a year while until you're at the age of about 45 or 50. I did that 2.5 year stint, and I learned discipline and the fact that I am a lover, not a fighter.
Yeah, fair enough.
Definitely. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit, Jared, about Fonterra, the business, and
Right. So
what they do?
So Fonterra, thanks very much, Will. Fonterra Co-operative Group is one of the largest dairy producers in the world. It's based out of New Zealand, but it's a huge multinational company. In Australia, Fonterra Australia has approximately 2,000 employees. It's an end-to-end business in that we source milk from farms, we process and manufacture that milk into consumer brands as well as for industrial purposes or for wholesale purposes. We value add to the milk, and we then on-sell the ingredients or the consumer products. In Australia, we have a number of consumer-facing brands. Those include Anchor, Mainland, as well as Western Star Butter, and we have an exclusive license to sell the Bega brand for cheddar cheese products.
Right, so it's pretty likely that listeners will have at least one Fonterra product in their home somewhere, hopefully in the fridge.
Yes, we calculated actually that, and this is all our sales boffins and our marketing boffins, they reckon that a Western Star or a Bega product is sold every second in Australia.
Wow.
So we've got quite a huge penetration. I mean, the Bega brand of cheese is Australia's best loved cheese. And that's followed up with our butter as well, where Western Star is a very prominent player. And our claim to fame, as it were, is that Western Star as well as Bega are all Australian sourced, and there are no additives in it. It is pure butter and pure cheese. We have no fortification. We have no artificial additives or anything like that. So we get the best milk from our farmers in Victoria and southern New South Wales and Tasmania, and we convert that into the products that we feel that Australians love.
Well, that's a pretty big span of operations. So how does that translate to a day? Like, what does a day's work look like for you? I mean, what you can't possibly be looking after all those things.
Well, the great thing about work, and this is what attracted me to Fonterra Australia because of its very large scope of operations. I mean, it's not just a manufacturer of products. It doesn't just package products. It doesn't just source milk from farms or process products. It does everything. And as such, as a lawyer, it's a really interesting area to be in because you get hit with varied questions every day and get involved in projects that you possibly wouldn't get in another organization. I mean, I deal on a daily basis with everything from marketing, can we make this claim? Can we wrap it in this color? To can we put this recycling logo on the label? Or we have a farmer who is undergoing difficulty and can't produce sufficient milk to meet his contractual requirements. What can we do there? We need to renew a lease on our plant and equipment, or the other day we had a shortage. We had a force majeure issue around the supply of carbon dioxide, which is required in part of our manufacturing process. So how do we deal with those supply chain issues and procurement? So it's fantastic. I see myself in this particular role much like an ER or an emergency room doctor. I mean, you can't possibly be the expert in everything, but you need to know enough to keep the company alive.
Yeah.
And to keep the issue at bay, and then appropriately go out and get specialist advice when you need to from people like CIE and our other partners, right, who can provide specialist input as and when we need it. That having been said, if you've ever worked in-house, as you have, Raph, you know that your management tends to look at you as the know-it-all for any legal issue, even if you have no experience.
Yeah. And sometimes non-legal issues. So I've sort of, my experience has been that it's often anything that's hard, it's dressed up as we need your help from a legal perspective, when really we need your help coming up with a strategy.
Yes, and I think that's really accurate. And that's really accurate. And I think that the reason for that, Raph, is I think that when you get into a good relationship with your management team and with the people in the business, let's call it the business, I think they appreciate that being a lawyer comes with a certain degree of clarity of thought and an objective view. So if they're coming to Raph or to Jared or to another lawyer in-house, it might not be specifically for a legal question, but because they appreciate that objectivity, that rationality that we apparently bring to a problem. And also because we have no skin in the game, because we don't have a profit and loss.
Yeah.
So we can look at it regardless of the financial biases that might be present and say, well, if it were me, it's not me. I don't get to make this decision, but I think you should look at A, B, and C.
Yeah. And it's free.
Exactly, and it's free. That's the most important thing. It's free.
Yeah. The milk's pretty complicated. Like it's highly regulated, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit? Does that play a big part of your work?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the operational side of collecting the milk, yes, that's heavily regulated with the Dairy Industry Code. Recently instituted Dairy Code of Conduct, which came out in 2020. Of course, that's overlaid with all our food and health and safety protocols and things like that. And we have compliance teams and operational teams who ensure compliance with all of those requirements at each factory, etc. And overlaid on that, we have environmental obligations. We have consumer regulations on top of that. We are a regulated industry, and any FMCG any sort of food manufacturer has those obligations, and rightly so. I mean, we want the public to have confidence in our product, to be able to eat safely, to purchase safely. But apart from our Australian regulations, we also have other regulations that apply. I mean, we supply ingredients via Australian source ingredients out to places like China or to Malaysia, where you have foreign regulations that go on and foreign certification that's required, especially around organic sourced material. And then you have, various other requirements, for example, halal or kosher requirements, depending on where you're selling into the market. So that does play a role. I mean, it's impossible for any one person to be all across it. What we do is we have a decentralized model where stakeholders are in charge of their own regulatory regime, as it were. So they know, they're the experts in what is required to get this certification or that certification, what is required to run the audits, and then on a needs basis, they come to us or come to me and my boss to then determine how we best meet those requirements. Because I mean, it's not as if I'm a walking encyclopedia of everything there is to do with food. I mean, as I said, I was originally from Singapore. All my food comes from a tin. Right, the net contribution of agriculture to Singapore's economy is 0%.
Yeah, it's a consumer of food, not so much a producer of food.
Totally consumer of food.
I like that though.
So Jared, you mentioned the Dairy Code has recently come in. How big of an impact has that had on Fonterra's operations day to day, do you think?
Well, first of all, let me say that I personally think that the Dairy Code was an excellent introduction. One particular thing I liked about it was the idea that all contracts have to be in a single document, as it were, even though that requires a bit of clarification, but mostly in plain English. And I'm a big proponent of plain English. I think that if lawyers can or companies can walk away a little bit from overcomplicated language where possible, that is a business advantage and a commercial advantage because it reduces your time to the deal. It reduces negotiation, it reduces negotiation time, management time, and reduces time to money, as it were, right? Which is what you want to look at. We reviewed our milk supply contracts in line with that. We in 2020 we redrafted all of them. We then got input from CIE Legal to assist us with that to ensure that everything was rigid and hunky-dory and met the requirements. We were very proud of the fact that while some of our competitors were pinged thereafter by the ACCC, we've had zero queries and zero concerns about our contracts from a dairy code perspective. Touch wood, where we're quite happy with that. That's not to say we can't continue to improve, because as the market develops or as the business develops, we sort of have to keep our contracts moving in accordance with that. So it has had some kind of an impact, and the farmers like it, right? The farmers like plain English. The farmers like clarity. They're businessmen. They're very sophisticated businessmen. At the end of the day, they're a lot of our suppliers are multi-generational farmers. They know how to do what they do best. They just need to be facilitated to do their best, and that's what we want. I mean, as a player in the dairy market for a number of years, and for the foreseeable future, while we will engage in single year contracts, that's not really the objective. The objective is to build a partnership for multi-year contract with farmers and suppliers, such that we have certainty of supply and can plan forward, but also we have time to build a relationship with our suppliers, to contribute to them our knowledge, skills, and experience. We have an entire department for that, right? We have an entire team called Farm Source, which is a differentiator with Fonterra. And Farm Source allows farmers or gives farmers a variety of facilities. They, can look at their projected milk production, their projected earnings, their year-on-year performance, their costs. We also have a team on the ground who are all ex-agronomists or ex-dairy farmers themselves, ex-agricultural experts, environmental experts who can go and assist our farmers or suppliers with environmental compliance. How do you do an environmental plan? Suggestions on feed, suggestions on animal welfare. So that's sort of a value add, I think.
And that's all funded by Fonterra?
Entirely by Fonterra, right? It comes as part of being a supplier. We have rigorous standards, and we think that, around, for example, animal welfare and environmental concerns. And we think that if we didn't support our farmers, then that would be unfair. You can't just tell someone you need to do A, B, and C and give them no way of doing that or get them to bear the cost of that. I mean, what we're trying to do is to, and I don't mean to sound arrogant, because, our farmers know what they're doing and they're multi-generational, but to sort of give that added input as a global player as to not just comply with Australian regulations, but sort of global expectations of what good sustainable farming methods are to provide the best possible product. Because, I mean, ultimately a happy cow provides better milk, right? And everything revolves around the milk price. For listeners who don't understand how this works, I mean, it's not just $2 a litre or something. It's quite a complicated formula where we determine the price of milk based on the kilograms of milk solids. So that's excluding the watery bit, how much fat and how much protein there is in that milk, and that is priced differently. So if you're pricing, $10 per kilogram of milk solids, for example, then if you're a better farmer with better cows and better feed, you can actually produce less milk and get the same amount of kilograms of milk solid, if that makes sense, because the quality is better.
That makes sense.
And why is that important? Because white milk that we sell out as drinking milk is not the real profit driver, right? It's a necessity, but it's a Geffen good, right? What you're really looking at is where are the value adds, and things like in cheese, things like ingredients. We have a ingredients business that sells into nutritionals. Everything is sold by fat and protein content because that's what you want in your nutritionals, for example. So we digressed a little bit around the dairy.
No,
food.
it's good.
Sorry.
We've covered a lot of ground. It's good. I want to go back to the help that you give farmers. That's quite a fine line, I suppose, to walk then, because you don't want to be telling them obviously how to do their jobs, but you've got the benefit of you work with suppliers all across Australia and across New Zealand, and you can probably know a lot more about what's going on sort of in the region as a whole.
Yes, I think that it is a fine line, and as a lawyer, I think we do speak to our team, and we say, there's a fine line between providing, financial advice or legal advice, as opposed to providing insights, which may not necessarily, we use the standard disclaimers, that may not necessarily take into account your personal circumstances, etc. Right?
Do not rely on this 500-page document that we've just
exactly
just there for
on you.
Just there for illustrative purposes.
Yeah, and mind you, our farm source team doesn't tell our suppliers you don't need an agronomist or you don't need someone else. We're just there, to provide suggestions and tips and hints, and because a lot of our farm teams come from farming families themselves and have backgrounds in agronomy or agriculture, it might just be a chat over a coffee when our team does regular visits, Bessie isn't performing that well. Well, have you thought about A, B, and C? Or I'd really like to increase the protein. Do you have any suggestions? Well, from our experience and from our pool of farmers, we find that people who use 3% more of X versus Y may get a slightly better outcome. So that sort of industry sharing, I mean, it really is in a sense no different from if farmers came around a round table and started trading stories and advice in that sense, right?
Sure. And that goes back to Fonterra being a cooperative owned by New
Zealand farmers, exactly. And that's, I think, really important because whatever we do for the end benefit of our New Zealand cooperative members, right? And their farmers as well. And it's in everyone's interest that we treat farmers fairly because we're owned by farmers.
Yeah. So, what's a nightmare scenario? Like, what's the worst thing what's the biggest thing you're afraid of happening?
Well,
because as lawyers, we're geared to think that way, right? We're always thinking about worst case scenarios. And I would think, with the products that you make and the scale of it, there's some risks.
Yes, of course. A nightmare scenario for any goods manufacturer, especially in food, is the danger of contamination and ultimately product recall. I think that while it's never happened to me while I've been with Fonterra, I think that because of the many, many moving parts in transforming milk into a cheese and selling it to consumers, I think that there will always be an opportunity for a breakdown or failure at some key point, and it could be anything. And while we have stringent quality and control processes and we're confident in our systems, it's never going to be a non-zero chance of occurrence. And I think that is what generally keeps me up at night. But the other thing that keeps me up at night,
Jared, and you see that even with less complicated food products, like you said, that was it lettuce or was it spinach that happened earlier this year?
Yes, I think it was lettuce that happened earlier this year because I think there was some hallucinogenic weeds or something that were accidentally incorporated into the lettuce, right?
Yeah.
And people got sick out of it. And, question mark, could that have been picked up or is it inevitable given the number of pre-prepared salads that make their way into supermarkets every year and the fact that I mean, I'm not a botanist by any means, but I mean, identifying a random weed in several metric tons of lettuce is probably a hard ask, right? This is not the same, obviously, as having a magnet to pick up metal shavings. This is a leaf.
Yeah.
So
and you're not even sort of processing it or refining it necessarily, as Fonterra does.
Yes, because in the lettuce example, you're just cutting up, washing it, and selecting it for the best look, feel, and taste, and sending it out. So these things get I wouldn't say missed, but these things unfortunately happen, and it's a byproduct of our industrial level of food manufacture.
Is all these alternative milk types, I've got lactose intolerant children and a lactose intolerant wife, so we have lactose free milk at home from Coles, and then you've got almond milk and soy and all those sorts of different things. Are they a threat to Fonterra and to farmers, I guess?
Yes. That's a really good question, and that's become really popular. These sorts of alternative plant-based milks, and I'll use that in inverted commas. I mean, there hasn't been much of a push in Australia to sort of differentiate plant-based, shall we call them juices, nut juices from milk, as there has been some push in New Zealand to do so. I think that it would be difficult. There has been some talk in the industry around differentiating it, much like the Europeans have, control over certain claims over provenance. Parma Reggiano can only come from the Reggiano region of Italy, for example, or Champagne can only come from the Champagne region. I mean, that's slightly different because that's a provenance issue. But the question is milk of such a level where you can then claim that only cow's milk or milk from a mammal is technically milk. Now, there will always be a market for plant-based alternatives or alternatives in general to dairy milk, and for a variety of reasons, for health reasons, for philosophical reasons, for religious reasons, and there's a space for that and a need for that. I think that while we are not blind to the threat, as it were, of the market, to the market for milk, I think that dairy milk still has a very strong following in Australia, as well as a very strong value proposition. I think, as we spoke earlier about fat and protein content,
nutritional value,
you can't really duplicate that in a nut milk without fortification. So the question then is, will the consumer be happy with an artificial fortification if they're only doing it for a philosophical reason, for example, and not because, in your example, people are lactose intolerant versus something else? That having been said, can I suggest that there are dairy milks that could assist with lactose intolerance?
Yeah, the ones we have at home are dairy milks. They just had their lactose taken out of them.
Or the alternative, because it's not all lactose that causes the issue, to my understanding. I'm not a scientist once again, but A2, one of our partners, sells and has a trademark over the A2 brand name, and they sell milk that only has the A2 protein. So apparently, to my understanding, there are two types of protein in milk, A1 and A2, and they're naturally mixed in all milk, except that it's only the A1 strain of the protein that causes lactose intolerance, or rather exacerbates the symptoms of lactose intolerance. And there have been some findings that a pure A2 protein milk does not so cause those issues. And it's about, and this is all genetically based in the cows. So the issue is, how do you produce a cow through selective breeding, etc., to produce only A2 quality milk. And that's what we do with some of our suppliers who supply it to the A2 brand. And we have very stringent processes around herd selection and testing, etc., right? That having been said, in terms of lactose intolerance, you will find that if your family loves cheeses, the older the cheese, the less the naturally occurring lactose is. So if you buy a very vintage cheddar, for example, there'll be virtually no lactose.
Cheeses are pretty Yeah, nearly as bad as sort of milk and cream,
In
as I've
terms,
learned.
That's fascinating. I had no idea.
no,
And
did
the-
I.
No.
Everything I've learned about milk has been learned against my will, as a lawyer, as a
Fair
dumb
enough.
lawyer, with no background originally in farming or in milk. Back on the supplementary, or rather the alternatives to milk from plants, I think this is my personal view, I think we need to distinguish between who is buying these alternate milks, right? And determine, as a dairy company, how we can address those concerns. We're not going to become a plant-based or oat milk manufacturer. We're a dairy company, right? So we need to look at the subdivision of the consumers who are purchasing alternatives and say, okay, there are people who are lactose intolerant. How do we address that with innovation? For example, via A2 milk, to draw them away from oat milk, for example, or any other kind of milk. The second is your philosophical consumers who say, I'm concerned about the impact of dairy farming on the environment. How do we address that? We address that through our environmental initiatives. So I'll give you an example of some of our environmental initiatives.
Can you tell us about the seaweed? I saw this in the show notes.
Yeah, there were a couple of things, actually. It's quite exciting. I mean, in Australia, we partner with a group called Sea Forest.
Sorry, I'm going to shout out and interrupt you because another of our podcast guests, Pasture, the electric car company, also partner with Sea Forest, and one of their ambassadors is the CEO, I think, of Sea Forest because of that sort of sustainability connection.
That's lovely. I wonder if through those contacts I can maybe get a discount on a Polestar. They're lovely cars. But yes, we partner with Sea Forest and the CSIRO. And what's happening is that we've had trials around a particular strain of seaweed. And this particular seaweed, when added to food, can possibly, or does apparently, reduce methane production in the natural course of cows' digestion. So your listeners might not know this, but one of the largest contributors to methane emissions from dairy farming comes from the burps of cows, both front and back, in the process of natural digestion because of the food they eat. I mean, we know they're ruminants, right? So they digest their food over a long period of time, and methane then builds up. So the question is, what can we feed, or how can we change the feed of the cows to maintain their health, to maintain protein, etc., and fat, while reducing carbon emissions or methane emissions in this particular example? And that is through the use of this the seaweed additive, which is a renewable resource, which reduces methane exposure. And also, interestingly, they've come up with this trademarked idea, which is I thought was quite amusing. It's called kombucha, and it's about fermentation because they're ruminants. The fermentation of the seaweed within their stomachs, as well as adding this fermented product to them, which is all natural, and then reducing their emissions of waste. So that's fantastic. Another one another initiative they're doing in New Zealand, which hasn't launched here, but recently won an award, I'm told, at Gulf Food, which is the Middle East's largest expo, is what Fonterra New Zealand is calling carbon zero butter, carbon zero organic butter. So through various processes and through replacement and good farm management, they've managed to obtain certification for carbon zero butter. So then our philosophical consumers, or consumers motivated to move to oat milk, can then be more comfortable with the fact that their choices aren't inadvertently causing significant environmental damage. I mean, as a New Zealand company,
what's behind carbon zero butter? What makes it carbon zero?
My understanding is that the processes reduce it, as well as there's a replacement for carbon, for example, planting of trees, etc., to neutralize any any otherwise negative consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Another example of this sort of environment neutral position is one of the big issues in New Zealand is obviously pollution of waterways and soil through dairy farming, and that's because of effluent. I mean, they're animals, they
Mm-hmm.
produce effluent, and management is an issue. They're experimenting apparently with plantain plantations, and plantain, as I'm told, is a form of banana,
Mm-hmm.
but not a sweet banana, some kind of a savory, if there's such a thing, a savory banana, and question mark whether these particular strains of plantain, when grown on dairy farms or the fringes of dairy farms, help to absorb the free effluent or the nitrogen before it enters the system, the rest of the environmental system. So what they're doing is trying to have a natural solution to a natural problem. And I think that to my knowledge, I don't think anyone else is doing that. And I think that that's a great step forward. And also, once again, addresses these issues with our philosophical consumers, right?
It's sort of it's now clear to me why you started your career cleaning the toilets, because it's almost like you've come full circle, using your expertise in that space, and now at Fonterra, you're cleaning it up, but this time you're doing it with plantain.
I can honestly say that the way we manage our cows, or we help our farmers to manage their herds, that the average cow is a lot cleaner than the average human.
Yeah, and you can say that with experience. So Jared, before we wrap up, we always ask our guests, if you were the Prime Minister for the day and you could change one law, what would it be?
Right. So this is
what allows us to call it legally consumed.
Yes, quite. I think, and I won't restrict myself to the dairy industry or anything like that, but in general, and possibly because I'm biased, because I originally come from a low tax jurisdiction like Singapore, I think that our tax system is overly complicated. I don't think it's conducive to business. I think having the numerous number of deductions allowable, the tax code, rulings by the ATO, having a whole industry of accountants and tax people who can file taxes for you, etc., and tax agents is unnecessary and wasteful. I think the amount of tax compliance that the average business or the average individual has to incur on a yearly basis is disproportionate. My suspicion is if I were PM, and that's not going to happen anytime soon, but if I were PM, I would reform our tax system, reduce our taxes in general, but also eliminate deductions so that it is simpler for the average individual to file their taxes. It's almost like a game, the tax in Australia, to me, is almost like a game. The government knows how much you're supposed to pay, but they won't tell you. And then they only tell you when you get it wrong. So it's like, I'm guessing what you want, but you know what you want, but let's see how far you push it. And that to me will be eliminated. I mean, put in what is our corporate tax rate now? 30%, 27.5% corporate tax rate, I think, if you're a small or medium enterprise. How is that competitive? That's not overly competitive. And our individual tax rates, I mean, they're looking at a marginal tax rate, I think, 42.5%, 43.5% or something. That is excessive. I mean, in Singapore, I'm not comparing once again, the top marginal tax rate is something like 20%, which kicks in at maybe 500 grand or something.
Right. Wow.
So, I think the move towards a consumption tax is probably a better sort of scenario for Australians, even though some people say that that unfairly discriminates against lower income earners. I suspect you could exclude a wider variety of goods and services from a GST and increase GST on non-essential goods. But once again, that's just me shooting the breeze, and I don't actually have to implement it. So I'll leave it to the elected officials.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jared. That has been fascinating, and thank you for joining us today, and good luck.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Will. Thank you very much, Raph.
Thank you. If you'd like any more information about Jared Pereira or Fonterra, just looking him up on LinkedIn, and I'm sure he'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you for tuning in to Legally Consumed, a consumer products podcast by the Consumer Products Law Firm. This was presented by Raph Goldenberg, Kay Ho, and Will McMinn from CIE Legal. Our theme song is by our very own CIE Legal house band, which is comprised of Will McMinn, Andrew Marr, and Andrew Thompson.
This podcast production is in partnership with Social Star.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. For more updates and behind-the-scenes footage, head to our Instagram at CIE Legal, all one word. You can also check out our website to listen to a range of episodes and find additional free information at www.cielegal.com.au. To get in contact with CIE Legal about consumer products legal services, reach out to us on info@cielegal.com.au. Thanks again for listening to Legally Consumed, and see you all in the next episode.